Hello and welcome to Czechast, your podcast in English about all things Czech. I'm Vít Pohanka, and no matter how old I am, I like to play with various gadgets. So I got this new, very smart camera, and I decided to record this episode of Czechast both in audio and video. So if you are listening on your podcast platform, which is for audio only, such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you may want to check my Facebook page or my YouTube channel, where I will put this video as well, so that you can see that. Nevertheless, I will be speaking to you as well. And since it's a beautiful winter day, I decided to show you around my hometown of Žďár nad Sázavou, which I often mention, I'm afraid, because I'm still very fascinated by this town where I actually grew up, spent part of my youth, and then I moved away to other cities, but I came back. And I think the story of the city is a very nice example of not just of what this town went through after Second World War especially, but in a way, I think, whole of Czechia. And now I'm going to take you to the place where the city of Žďár, or town of Žďár, was started many centuries ago.
Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
I'm walking now to the most historic part of the town, which we these days call Zámek Žďár, or Chateau Žďár, even though originally it was actually a Cistercian monastery. I think I'll turn the camera to show you a little bit more of the countryside. As you can see if you watch this episode, or as you can perhaps hear if you are just listening, on my right hand side there's a little creek. It's the beginning of the Sázava river, which is part of the name of the town. Žďár nad Sázavou means literally Žďár on the Sázava. It's really rather a creek than a river here, but it grows a little stronger as it flows through the town, because there are a few other streams that join this main stream, and it becomes a little stronger. I can see some skiers, and maybe you can hear them as well around me. Cross-country skiing especially is very popular in this part of the country, traditionally. After all, we are not far from Nové Město na Moravě, another small town, I think about 8 kilometers as the crow flies. And that's a place where the World Cup in biathlon takes place more or less regularly each year in the past few years. A lot of people come here as tourists, and some of them stay here in Žďár as well. So now I'm going to the former monastery, now Zámek or Chateau Žďár, which was officially founded, according to the records, in 1252. So in the 13th century. Pretty soon we'll be remembering the 800 years, if I'm counting right, of the official existence of Žďár, even though, according to archaeologists, in another part of what is now Žďár nad Sázavou, there was a settlement even before the monastery, but there are no written records. And the founding of the monastery by a aristocrat, a nobleman, Boček z Obřan, in 1252 remains the official date that we consider the founding of Žďár. Now I'm leaving a kind of busy road. It's one of the main roads through the town of Žďár, and I'm entering the whole, I would even call it a complex of the former monastery, later turned into a chateau. As you can see, there are some information signs which are both in Czech and in English, and this is thanks to the Kinský family. Now you can look up one of the previous episodes of Czechast from 2025, where the guest was Konstantin Kinský, the owner of this chateau now, together with his wife. I think it's a very interesting story, and this is not the place to retell it again. So let me just mention that the Kinski family got the chateau back in restitutions. They had been living in France for most of the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s, and they came back in the 1990s. And they are really doing a marvelous job, because I think people with lesser imagination might try to turn this place into a sort of luxury hotel, or they got a lot of land back as well, so they could start, I don't know, a golf resort or something like that. But they not only reconstructed, repaired the whole complex, are still working on it, because obviously it's work for many, many years ahead. As you can see here, they are just building new roof, I think, on one of the buildings, which actually served, at least for a time, as a museum. So they are reconstructing it, but they are also very open to the public. They organize various festivals here. There's a folk music festival, there's a correspondence dance event festival with many kind of workshops, etc. And what we see here as well, which is kind of interesting, there is still a very old school, which is part of one of the more modern schools in the town itself. Children are still coming here, and that's when I spoke to Konstantin Kinski. He said he's very glad about that, because that if you've got children somewhere, well, they are not here right now because it's already after school hours, but that means that the place is alive. So what you can see now is actually how the monastery already was rebuilt in the early 18th century, at the beginning of the 18th century, by a very famous architect, Giovanni Santini Eichel. As the name suggests, he was of Italian origin, even though he was third generation Italian living in Prague, but he started cooperating with the abbot of the then still monastery, Cistercian monastery, Abbot Václav Vejmluva. And during about 2 decades, I think, they built really something very unique. I will tell you more about Santini Eichel when we get to a pilgrimage church, which put Žďár, I would say, on the global map when it comes to sites. What is interesting, what I find quite fascinating about the story as well, is that Václav Vejmluva, the abbot, by reconstructing the whole monastery in a very grand style back in the 18th century, he got the monastery into terrible debts, out of which it probably never got before it was cancelled, as many other orders and many other monasteries, by Joseph II in the latter part, or in the late 18th century. So I'm going to walk around a little bit and see whether I can get inside some of these buildings. And obviously I'm in luck, because the Basilica of Saint Mary of the Assumption and Saint Nicholas is open to visitors, so we can at least peep in. It's another of the building that was rebuilt by Giovanni Santini, the 18th century. If you are just listening, this is really a grand church. Basilica, it means that it's more important than just an ordinary church, to put it bluntly, for us lay people. And there are some features which would be quite difficult for me to describe in audio, and I cannot show, unfortunately, in video, which are very unique. So if I come here from time to time, I see actually, or at least I've met more than once, a group of students of architecture who are coming here to study the work of Giovanni Santini. But it's not just a place for visitors from abroad. This is a living church. This is what we call a farní kostel. So it's a parish church of this Catholic community. Well, Czechs, as you might have read somewhere or you know, are not most church-going people in Europe. I think I did an episode of Czechast about that as well. Actually, we are one of the least church-going nation in Czechia, which is kind of ironic when you think about all the beautiful churches and places of worship that we have here in Czechia, including my hometown, Žďár. I'm stepping now out of the chateau, actually, and when I mentioned that the owners are opening this place for various events, for various cultural events mainly, even festivals, I didn't mention that they built a very unique museum here. It's called Muzeum Nové generace, the New Generation Museum. I think it was opened sometimes around 2010, maybe a little later. And it's really unique in the sense that it's very interactive, it's very attractive for kids as well, very multimedia. And it gives you a kind of flavor what life was like, especially when this place was a monastery. Because the Cistercians, they were very well known for their motto, which is modli se a pracuj. You pray and you work. They were very hard working, which in this part of Bohemia, or Moravia, we are already in Moravia, we are very close to the border between Moravia and Bohemia. So let me rephrase, in this part of Czechlands, life was very hard. We are some nearly 600 meters above the sea level, which would be like 1800 feet above the sea level. The winters can be quite cold here. Summers are cooler. This is not exactly a fertile region like Polabí, you know, along the Elbe River, or Hana in Moravia, or other places which are lower and are much more fertile. So life was hard here, in other words. And Cistercians for centuries were working here. And that's what you can see very well in this museum. There would probably, let me film there, but I don't want to spend too much time there. And I think still it's much better if you happen to be here, if you see it with your own eyes and hear it, because they actually have the audio part of that, and the visual part is recorded in English too. So it's multilingual. I suppose they have German and French as well, maybe Russian. So it's a very modern place, and just another kind of example what you can do with a place like this if you really want to open it and if you want it to be a part of the community. And that's what Kinski really managed to do here very, very well. So, as you can see, and probably hear as well, I'm now actually going to the place which put Žďár on the global map when it comes to architectural heritage. And it's on a hill, and obviously kids and their parents are enjoying a beautiful winter day with good weather for enjoying winter sports. So even now in the 21st century you can still see that people don't always need, and especially kids don't always need, computers or social networks to have some fun. And I think it's kind of comforting for me. I think that's the word I would use. Life still goes on as it did when I was a kid, and probably much earlier before. So now I'm looking at the chateau or monastery complex from a small hill, which is called officially, somewhat pompously, I would say, Zelená hora, or Green Hill. And the reason why I came here is this beautiful church, which stands right on top. It's the pilgrimage church of Saint John of Nepomuk. It was designed, yeah, you can now hear obviously the bells. It was designed by the aforementioned architect Giovanni Santini Eichel in the second decade of the 18th century, I believe. And it's a masterpiece. It's a masterpiece of very unique and special architecture. When you look at it, you can see that it looks like a Baroque building, but there are many Gothic elements. That's why it's called Baroque Gothic. And that's not the only thing that is special about it. There are unique shapes, and there's a lot of hidden meaning as well in the shape if you look at it from bird's perspective as well, because Santini was quite learned in Kabbalah, if you've heard of it. It's kind of this teaching about hidden meanings of numbers and shapes, etc. And there are a lot of things that you can actually discover here if you know what you should be looking for. Now, you can probably, if you are listening now and you don't see it, you can just Google the church and find out more about it. I will just say that as a kid, believe it or not, I played a lot around here. At that time, actually, this whole area around it was covered in, it was woods, basically. There were trees everywhere. But when Czechia had this church inscribed in the World Heritage List of UNESCO back in the 1990s, one of the conditions for the inscription was that the forest has to disappear, because the official idea of Jan Blažej Santini Eichel, that's his real Czech name, was that it needs to be on this kind of open hill as it is now. And you can see it from a great distance. It's a great pilgrimage site, and quite often when I come here, and I come here, well, not on a daily basis, but more or less every week at least when I'm walking our dog, especially in summer, you meet a lot of people from all over the world. I met a group of students of history of art from New York a few years back. Sometimes you meet some students of architecture. It's a very unique place that is definitely worth visiting. And it brings me back to my my mention, or my what I said about the history of Žďár, kind of reminding us of the history of the whole country. Now, when I look at this church, I think, well, this is what they built here in the 18th century. And then, when I look at the city, I don't know if you can see it very well in the video, but let me describe it to you if you are listening. I can see the smokestacks of a factory, Žďár, that was built here in late 1940s, early 1950s. And that's what we are leaving, the 20th century left to the town. Nevertheless, I don't mean that, all was bad under communism. It definitely meant that Žďár became something of a boomtown, because when the Second World War ended, Žďár had less than 5,000 inhabitants. And then, when the factory was built, a lot of people came. It meant a lot for the local economy, and the city grew to nearly 25,000 inhabitants, which I think was the peak in the mid-1980s. It then became a little smaller again after the fall of communism, because a lot of the villages that became part of Žďár under communism officially, they selected to go their own way. So Žďár has now about 20,000, slightly more than 20,000 inhabitants. So the population basically, if I'm counting around, at least quadrupled, maybe grew fivefold in one period of time, in less than 3 decades, which I think is quite unique. And it makes me think, what we are leaving are these blocks of flats that I will show you a little later. And what the generations before us left us are these beautiful buildings and places. But again, I don't want to be kind of grumpy and complaining about what we have here. Now, I just think it's kind of worth remembering that, especially when you are trying to build something new. I actually did a program in Czech, that is. It was a kind of documentary a few years back. And the idea was, would Santine be able to build something like this here now in the 21st century with all the regulations that we have? And most likely, he wouldn't be able to build a church like this because the local regulation, we are in a protected landscape area, and probably he would be told that something like this simply doesn't traditionally belong here, which is, I think, another piece of food for thought, because, of course, we should mind our traditions, we should think about them and we should respect them, but we have to develop as well. We have to come with something new as well. I don't want to become too philosophical, but that's what comes to my mind when I'm standing here in the place where I spent a lot of time playing boyish games. I kept coming back, and now I live here again, and I like it here very much, I have to say. So, I'm going to take a few shots from the inside to show you, or put on the web page, and then I will show you around other parts of my hometown of Žďár. Now I'm walking down one of the streets in Vysočany. It's a part of the town where I actually grew up. It's a kind of neighborhood of mostly detached family homes that were built. I think they started in the 60s, maybe late 50s, then 60s, when my parents actually moved in. And then people kept on building houses here even in the 70s, not 80s, I think. And it was then, in the 70s or 80s, I believe, considered to be slightly posh, if there was such a thing as posh in communist Czechoslovakia. Because, I mean, if you had, the means and obviously the money, the possibility to build your own home in a communist country, and you didn't have to live in a block of flats, that was considered to be better living. And you had your garden, which was a place to escape under communism, obviously. So I grew up here, and I want to mention, again, this reminds me of the story of the whole nation, not just Žďár nad Sázavou. When I was a small boy in the 1970s, I remember us even playing football in the street and spending a lot of time in the streets because there were much fewer cars. I mean, there were some cars, even we had a car, but it wasn't like what it is today, or even what it was becoming, I think, in the 1980s already. You wouldn't see probably kids playing in the street. And it's totally unthinkable today, obviously. There are so many cars that people haven't got space to park them, because when they were building these houses, nobody had more than place for one car, normally in a garage. And today, of course, even Czech families have very often, if not most Czech families with kids would have more than one car. And you can see that we are adjusting our life to cars everywhere. So it's definitely not a posh part of Žďár nad Sázavou today, but I'm very fond of this part of the town. Not just because I grew up here, it's mostly quiet, people have gardens. My mum actually still lives here. She's going to be 90 later this year. And she couldn't imagine living anywhere else. Just one thing I would like to mention, what you can maybe see behind me are slightly different kinds of housing units. These would be bytovky, as we call them, or čtyřbytovky. And they were houses where 4 flats were built. They were usually built in in a way that we called své pomoc. That meant that you put some money, some investment at the beginning into a cooperative, but then you were expected to work on the house yourself. Of course, I mean, you would need plumbers and some, expert work done by experts, but most of the hard everyday building was done by the people who lived in the houses themselves. And yes, what we can see behind me is a public transport. Yes, we do have public transport in Žďár nad Sázavou. We have at least 8 lines of buses. People do rely on them, but I have to say that quite often I see the buses that are running completely empty when it's not the rush hour. We do have a rush hour even here in Žďár, but we still keep the public transport, which is heavily subsidized by the city and I believe the region as well, but I'm not quite sure about that. And so much about Vysočany, this nice part of town with gardens. And now I'm taking you closer to the center of Žďár. Now, on my way to the center of the town from Chateau, I stopped in front of a building that was finished when I was a boy at elementary school. It's a Zimní stadion. It's an ice rink, basically. And this was a big part of my life in the 70s and the 80s. Not that I did ice hockey, but Žďár nad Sázavou had a fairly good ice hockey team. They played not the completely top league in Czechoslovakia, but the top league in Czech Republic, which was already then one part of the Federative Republic. So, at this winter stadium or ice rink, we would spend many hours watching games of ice hockey. And there was also a very good speed skating club. Maybe you have heard the name Martina Sáblíková. She just actually finished her official career now at the Winter Olympic Games at Milan Cortina. And she's a many times Olympic Games winner and World Championships winner. And she's from Žďár. That's why I mentioned that. She grew up here later than I. She was born in the late 1980s. So she grew up mostly after the fall of communism. And she's a magnificent speed skater. And there has always been, as far as I remember, a very good high quality speed skating club here in Žďár. And she's a kind of living proof of that. She still lives in Žďár, by the way, comes here quite often. And but I don't know her. I don't know. Maybe I'll interview her one of these days for Czechast. So on now to show you how actually most people in Žďár live and where they live. So now I'm standing on quite a busy street in front of the typical panelák, as we call them. It's a housing block made of prefabricated parts, like many others. I'll try to turn the camera to give you a better feeling of what it looks like. Now, paneláky were started being built in the 1960s, but they were mostly connected with the 1970s and 1980s in Czechoslovakia. Of course, it was all connected, or it was a result rather of a nearly permanent housing crisis. There were more people than there were flats, so they needed to build the flats very quickly. And this sort of, I would say, Soviet-style housing estates developed, of course, all over Czechoslovakia. And I actually looked up some statistics, and according to the latest censuses in Czechia, which were last census rather in Czechia, was in 2021. And in Žďár, 3/4 of the population live in these blocks of flats. Not exactly in these blocks of flats. Some of them were built earlier, still from bricks. But it just shows that most of the people came here after Second World War. So my mum, for example, who lives in a one family housing unit in a normal house is in a minority in Žďár. Only about 25% of people live in small homes. Most of them live in these housing estates. And that's why we like to say sometimes that the Žďár is, as a matter of fact, quite an ugly town if you do not see the chateau and the historic part that I showed you. It's an ugly town with a beautiful landscape around it, with beautiful environments. And I think that's fairly true. I actually did a program, even in English now that I think of it, about paneláky, because it's an interesting phenomenon. All over Czechia, about 1/3 of people live in paneláky, paneláky proper, these types of houses, housing estates. In Prague, the percentage is slightly higher, over 40%. Again, it's got something to do with the fact that Prague was growing rapidly in the 70s and 80s. And the big question is, what do you do with these houses? Because they were built to last only some 30 or 40 years. And now they are 40 years old, so they should be at the end of their lifespan. But luckily enough, according to experts, we now have new technologies. They can be improved, reconstructed. You can see that people actually make quite nice balconies. And as a matter of fact, my father-in-law and my mother-in-law live in one of these houses, and it's, especially if you are retired, it's kind of comfortable. You don't have to take care of anything, unlike if you have your own house. So a lot of people live here. I frankly wouldn't like to live here, but I'm not judgmental. I'm not saying there's anything wrong about living here like this. So this is the kind of modern face of Žďár nad Sázavou, my hometown. I arrived to the center of Žďár. What you can probably see behind me is the church of Saint Procopius. Again, a very nice example of a church that was originally Gothic, but was rebuilt in Baroque style and now is undergoing reconstruction. That's why I'm not taking you directly to it. But what I'll do, I'll turn the camera to the other side and show you the square, what it looks like. Now, on this side, there are some still quite nice, I would say, historic houses. Not picturesque, very picturesque, like the Baroque and Renaissance houses that you can find in many other Bohemian and Moravian towns like Telč or Český Krumlov, but still, they have their charm, I think. Unfortunately, when I was growing up in the 1970s and 1980s, we had a communist mayor in Žďár, and his name was Antonín Bubák. Now, I don't know how good or bad your Czech is, but Bubák means boogeyman, literally. So his name was something like Antonín, I would say the boogeyman, Antonín Bubák. And this communist functionary came with this plan, which he managed to have kind of sanctioned by the higher authorities. And he decided to rebuild the whole square in a true socialist, you would say communist style. So, almost single-handedly, he managed to have one half of this square completely demolished, because there were older historic houses that, as he would put it, and some other communist functionaries, were not like socialist city or socialist town, should look like. And they completely demolished them. What needs to be said, it's true, when I was growing up, most of the houses on this part of the square were kind of dilapidated. But that was a result of the nationalization from the 1950s, when a lot of the houses before had been family businesses. People had shops or some workshops there as well. And when the communists came, they were all nationalized. So the people in most cases didn't even own their own houses where they grew up and lived for generations, but they lacked the means and the money to repair them and to upkeep them, to keep them looking nice. So it wasn't their fault. But well, be it as it may, I mean, they were demolished, and under Antonín the Boogeyman, they built these ugly boxes. I mean, they have been again repaired, kind of reconstructed, repainted, so they don't look as ugly as they did look when I was growing up, because they were completely grey. There were big shops there, but obviously now, you know, some of them are empty. There are some shops. It's not kind of town blight, you know, that you would call that. The buildings are not empty, but not, you know, we still don't know what to do with them, because they are very expensive to heat, and that was something, of course, when they were built under communism, that the communists weren't thinking about at all, because energy was cheap. And we ended up with this strange square. This is actually the old town hall, historic town hall that you can see that's being reconstructed as well. But there's very little charm, if any charm at all, here. Luckily enough, they at least left some of the old historic structures here, like this. It's called Morový Slope. I suppose it would be plague column, and it was built by the grateful people of Žďár in either late 17th or early 18th century as a kind of gratitude, out of gratitude that plague avoided their town. So that, at least that's what was left here. But otherwise there's not much charm, there's not much atmosphere, you know. And I suppose the worst thing is that they kept the main thoroughfare right in the middle of the town. So there's a lot of traffic here, sometimes farming, tractors, etc. And you can see heavy lorries, heavy trucks going right in the middle of the city or the town, where people need to cross the streets, etc. Not very charming. Anyway, I'll turn the camera to myself again. Here I am. I have to say that I sort of underestimated how soon the sunset comes now in winter. So I would like to still show you more of my hometown of Žďár, but I will probably have to leave it till tomorrow, which you will not mind at all, because I will edit it and put it next to each other. But for today, from the center of Žďár nad Sázavou, that's all. And we will continue for you in a few seconds, for me tomorrow.
Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
So I'm back. As the weather forecast rightly predicted, it started snowing. The sun is not shining, but it is still a very nice winter day. Now, where am I? I'm in a place that everybody in Žďár calls Stalingrad. And let me show you around a little bit. Why people call it Stalingrad? This was the first housing estate or housing project that was built in Žďár in the early, or rather they started building it in the early 1950s for the workers of a newly built Žďár factory, quite a huge factory, well, big factory, definitely the biggest employer around. It specialized in metallurgy, by the way, and mechanical engineering. And since they started building it in the 1950s, early 1950s, when Josef Vissarionovich Stalin was still very much in power in Moscow, it was kind of automatic that a project like this would be called in his name. Later on, in 1956, when the cult of personality of Stalin was officially denounced, not just by the Soviet Communist Party, but kind of automatically again the Czechoslovak Socialist Party, the town authorities tried to change the name. Or they officially, kind of bureaucratically, said it's no longer Stalingrad, but Žďár nad Sázavou 3. Nevertheless, the name stuck, and till this day, nobody that I know in Žďár would be talking about Žďár nad Sázavou 3. Everybody knows it's Stalingrad or Staloš, as we call it. And what's very interesting is this kind of ideological artwork that you can still find here on some of the houses. And here, this next kind of image, I think it's officially called as graffito panel, celebrates the 5th World Festival of Youth and Students, which took place in Warsaw in 1955, and it officially kind of celebrated peace and friendship. So you can still find these remnants of the communist ideology, and I think the story is quite interesting because most of these housing units, or these houses, blocks of flats, apartment blocks, actually had such ornamentation. Unfortunately, in my opinion, at least unfortunately, in the 1990s and early 2000s, as people started modernizing them and they put some extra insulation on them, which does make sense from a practical point of view, but unfortunately a lot of this communist artwork disappeared. And I think it's kind of telling and an interesting feature of social life here, that a group of young, especially young people who actually didn't experience communism much, started saying that it's in a way barbaric. They shouldn't be getting rid of this ideological artwork because it's a historical kind of artifact. So they did keep it on some of the houses, unfortunately not many of them. Let me just add that even though this housing project or estate was built under communism in the 1950s, the quality of the buildings is actually quite good. They were built from solid brick and mortar, I think you would call it. It was definitely better quality than the paneláky, or the blocks of flats made of prefabricated parts that I showed you earlier, which were built in the 70s and 80s. So even though these buildings are older, the quality of the accommodation or of the housing is actually quite good. The only disadvantage is that the flats or apartments are quite small, because I suppose in the 1950s people didn't need as much space as we do now. And another big thing that you will notice is a lot of cars around here. Unfortunately, a lot of the green spaces that were here before were turned into these car parks, because again in the 1950s, as they were building these houses and these places, they didn't expect that people would have I don't know, maybe they expected that people wouldn't have any cars at all, but certainly they didn't expect that people would have so many cars as we have today. Anyway, I think Stalingrad is in a way fascinating witness of history, not just of Žďár, my hometown, but of this part, of this period rather, in the history of Czechia. I think this walk around Žďár wouldn't be complete if I didn't at least show you the entrance to Žďár, this big factory that dominated the life of this town for the whole second half of the 20th century. Let me again show you around a little bit. This is just the entrance again. I can't film inside. It's quite a large complex. And this was by far the largest employer, not just in Žďár, but in the larger region. At its heyday, it employed about 5,000 or 6,000 people, and it specialized, as I think I mentioned, in metallurgy and mechanical engineering. And I thought, frankly, that after the fall of communism, that this factory would go bankrupt, because it was built kind of artificially here. We have no coal, which it needed a lot of. etc. But it didn't go bankrupt. It still survives, albeit much smaller. Here are some panels about what they make there. I think it employs 2,500 or 3,000 people now, which is less than a half than it used to. It was broken up also into smaller parts. There are smaller companies still in the kind of complex, but they are called differently, not Žďár. And what I think is quite telling is that it was privatized first after the fall of communism, and then it did survive, but life was hard, not very well. So it was actually bought by the Chinese I think about 10 or 8 years ago. So it's officially Chinese-owned company now in my hometown of Žďár nad Sázavou, still the biggest employer. And maybe I should mention, here I am again, that unemployment rate is still quite low here. As I thought as a young student still then after 1989 when communism fell, I was afraid that we would get into similar economic problems like they had in Poland, but the economic transformation went much more smoothly here, even in Žďár. So last time I checked, the unemployment rate is somewhere between, I think, 4, sometimes 5%, which is not maybe ideal, but it is still quite low. And at least partially it's thanks to Žďár, even though the economy of the town obviously had to diversify after the fall of communism in the 1990s. Well, it's snowing quite a lot, as you can probably see, and I thought it would be appropriate to end this episode of Czechast, this little walk around my hometown, here at the railway station, because we are quite lucky in Žďár. What you can see behind me is the second most important line between Brno and Prague. So we have frequent and reliable connection to Prague and Brno, of course, and the rest of the country, for that matter. So I, for example, need to get to Prague usually at least once, but sometimes also twice or even 3 times a week from time to time. And it's fairly easy. I just hop on a train here. There are trains every hour in the morning and later on in the afternoon. And it's not a very short journey. It takes about 2.5 hours. But the train takes me directly to the main railway station, Hlavní nádraží in Prague, very close to the Czech radio building, which is the place where I most often have to get to. Let me also mention, before I say goodbye, that I remember times when we had direct train connection between Žďár and Budapest and even Berlin. Well, not anymore, unfortunately, but I think it still shows kind of nicely that Žďár has always been quite well connected, not just to the rest of the country, but to the rest of the Europe, if not world. I think that's where I will end this experimental episode of Czechast. As I like to say, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay curious. And until next time, as we say in Czech, naslyšenou.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.